I'd like to welcome everybody to this IISS webinar on Myanmar after the polls. My name is Adam Ward. I'm Director of Studies at the Institute, and I'm going to be chairing the two presentations and the discussions that we will have over the next hour or so. The title of this webinar is Myanmar after the polls, a foreseeable result with a less foreseeable set of consequences. And that really reflects our assessment that what we are seeing beginning on the 8th of November is a significant milestone in Myanmar's troubled modern political history. But what exactly does it presage for the continued political evolution of the country, for the coherence of a government that will eventually be formed, for the kinds of economic policies that it will choose to pursue, for the foreign policy posture it will adapt and adopt, and for the peace process, which is another urgent policy consideration. I'm joined this morning by two of my colleagues. First by Hervé Lemahieu, who is a Research Associate for Political Economy and Security with a particular focus on transitional politics and the role of the military in Southeast Asia. And then by Jens Wardenaer, who is a Research Analyst at the Institute and also Coordinator of the IISS Armed Conflict Database. We'll first hear from Hervé Lemahieu, who will provide an assessment of some of the possible scenarios and the state of play in the critical period following the elections. He'll seek to map out also some of the policy priorities to which I alluded a moment ago. And then we will turn to Jens for an assessment of the national peace process, which involves the major ethnic armed groups, including also the issue of some heavy fighting with non-signatory groups in the country's resource-rich northeast. Hervé will speak for about 15 minutes and Jens for about 10, and then we will welcome some interventions and questions from you. And the easiest way for you to ask a question is to use the chat function. You can do that right now, or you can do it at any point during the presentations. The questions will come through to me as moderator, and then I will select them and read them out and put them to the appropriate panelists. So without further ado, Hervé, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. As you rightly pointed out, this is a landmark election, one that will be a game changer in one sense or another, perhaps not always as positively or as rose-tinted as some of us would like to hope, but in one way or another, change is coming in Myanmar. This is the first election that the main opposition party, that is the National League for Democracy, is contesting in 25 years, the first general election, and possibly could lead to the first democratic transfer of power in Myanmar since 1960, just to put things into context. We have 91 political parties contesting this election, but only 10% of those parties are running at a national level. So really this is looking more and more like a two-way contest between the incumbent Union Solidarity and Development Party, which is a party which was founded or has its origins in 1993, founded by the military at that point in 1993, became its own civilian body following the transition of power from alt-right military rule in 2011, and is headed by President Thein Sein, who hopes to secure a second term as president if the elections go well or in favor of the USDP. On the other side, we have the National League for Democracy, an opposition party which also has its origins in the 1990 elections, which ossified under a period of house arrest for its leaders, and has now been re-legalized since 2011, contested the by-elections, and looks well placed, in fact, to win the largest representation in Parliament, if not an outright majority. But before we go into scenarios, I think it's worth mentioning that this is also the end of a very peculiar period in parliamentary history, which some analysts have termed helpful ambiguity. and this was a period from the by-elections in which the NLD contested, and which allowed Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the National League for Democracy, to re-enter parliament, as it were. But the overwhelming majority of the lower as well as upper house was still dominated by the USDP, the military-backed USDP. That looks set to change. So you may be able to see in the screens in front of you a constituency map of Myanmar with colored largely in green for the color of the USDP, with a few sporadic constituencies in red representing the National League for Democracy and their gains made at by-elections in 2012, and then a host of other predominantly ethnic minority political parties, which you see in the border areas east, north, and west of the main Burman ethnic majority areas. That is almost certain to reverse that picture. We're likely to start seeing a sea of red as soon as the election results come out officially on the 21st of November, which causes a certain degree of alarm. I mean, many people see in 2015 essentially a repeat of the 1990 elections, where the NLD won with a landslide, but that result was never respected by the military, and it resulted in a further 20 years of direct military rule before we arrived at this stage. It now seems, though, that the military has had a long time to plan and has in many ways preempted what it probably considered to be a inevitable NLD return to politics. It has enshrined within the 2008 constitutions certain safeguards which really protect its core interests. These include up to 1/4 of all legislative seats, which means that it has influence in lawmaking, and more importantly, it has a veto over constitutional changes which require a parliamentary supermajority. The military retains the right to appoint the ministers of defense, home affairs and border affairs, regardless of who wins and who becomes president, giving it control over the key security portfolios of the country. And to complete that picture, Section 59F of the Constitution prevents the National League for Democracy leader Suu Kyi from becoming president because it bars any candidate with children who are foreign nationals for being considered as a nominee for the presidency. So with those safeguards in place, I think we can rule out the option largely that there will be a sudden rescinding of the results, the election results, when they come out on the 21st of November. On top of that, it's probably going to be a good enough election. It's reasonably free and fair. We can argue about the details on that one, but certainly compared to the 2010 general elections, where the NLD boycotted participation in that, and the number of international observers, the presence of international journalists, a vibrant local media, all watching, which would make it very much more difficult to manipulate the vote in ways that were perhaps done in 2010. So we can rule that out to a large extent as well, I believe. So what is the most likely outcome? There are no polling data which we can reliably draw on, but I think given that the broad popular support that Suu Kyi enjoys, particularly among the Burman majority, the NLD is poised to become the largest party in parliament, perhaps not with an outright majority, but certainly with a significant margin. And what does that mean? It also means that the USDP stands to witness a massive decline in its current 70% of elected seats. And perhaps also minority ethnic parties will do well in their areas, but given Myanmar's complex ethnic mosaic, I think vote splitting will reduce essentially the leverage they can exercise in parliament. So we have three scenarios in my opinion. The first is an absolute majority for the NLD within parliament. In order to do that, it would need to win about 332 seats, according to my arithmetic, or 66% of all constituencies. in order to assure itself of an absolute majority in Parliament, which obviously 25% is unelected and appointed directly by military, hence the skewing effect. That is entirely probable. Then the second scenario is that it doesn't gain an absolute majority, but still becomes the largest party by a significant margin. It would need at least 265 seats, or about 53% of the overall constituencies it's contesting, to gain a 40% stake in the combined Houses of Parliament. That will be the magic number in order to put forward its preferred candidate for president. The third scenario is one which I'm calling the sort of horse trading scenario, one in which the NLD still becomes the largest faction, but perhaps short of 40%. We may see the USDP retain up to 15%. The USDP, with the military bloc, through some clever conniving, may actually be able to muster a credible threat for the NLD in Parliament and subvert an NLD presidential candidate when the Electoral College convenes in January. Now, we will have 4.5 months in which all of these scenarios would potentially unfold. So we're dealing with a very symbolic election, but then almost an anticlimactic period of transition marked by a great degree of uncertainty. And that, I think, is something not adequately understood by a lot of international observers and journalists. The election results for Parliament will not produce or immediately make clear who the president will be. And this is a presidential system at the end. That is that when the three electoral colleges, when the lower house, upper house, and military come together and each appoint a presidential candidate, it is that successful candidate who then appoints the cabinet, and it is a very strong cabinet which ultimately determines the direction and governance in the next 5 years for Myanmar. So there may well be a discrepancy between the election results and the final outcome in terms of who becomes the next president. Suu Kyi has discussed several strategies by which she could overcome some of the constitutional obstacles in her way. It's clear that she sees an NLD mandate as a personal mandate to rule. She sees this as destiny unfolding in itself. She has long had the ambition to become the most prominent person in the country, and has made very explicitly the case in the last few days in particular that she would rule above any president, including her nominee for president, and that probably will significantly affect her relationship with the military, if not contradict outright the 2008 Constitution. Clause 58 of the Constitution says no person has precedence over the president, and I can see this being heavily fought over if this becomes the explicit modus operandi for the NLD, a Suu Kyi quasi-presidency or nominal presidency, or with a weak appointee in the executive. So what are the long-term consequences? I think clearly, even if the NLD manages to appoint a president, what will be paramount is its relationship with the military. Nothing gets done in governance terms, nothing gets done in terms of the peace process, in terms of constitutional reform, even in terms of the day-to-day management of the Home Affairs Ministry and the General Administration Department, which permeates the entire country, without some degree of cooperation, engagement with the deep state, which very much retains prominence and is intact regardless of the outcome of the elections. I think I'll leave it at that, and we can discuss some more of the consequences in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hervé. Jens.
Thank you, Adam. The signing of a nationwide ceasefire agreement, or NCA, in Naypyidaw on 15th of October this year, after years of negotiations, have finally brought Myanmar's long-running conflict close to an end, and is an historic step. This conflict broke out soon after independence from Britain in 1948, and so it's one of the longest-running conflicts in the world. Since then, a disorientating number of rebel groups have remained in varying degrees of control of resource-rich border territories. Numbers are difficult to verify, but the IISS unconfident database estimates that around 17,000 people have been killed just in 1985. There are some 650,000 estimated internally displaced people in the country, and nearly 1 million refugees, most of them across the border in Thailand. Intermittent attempts at peace have failed, although the current effort, which took place without third-party mediation but with peace-building support from international actors, looks more likely to succeed than those in the past. However, it was only signed a few weeks ago by 8 of the 15 ethnic armed groups that were invited to do so, leaving a large number of groups that took part in the talks, as well as others that did not, out of the agreement. Only 2 of the signatory groups, namely the Karen National Union and the Restoration Council of Shan State, have significant armed forces. This is a challenge to the credibility and durability of the agreement. I'll now look at why this happened, what are the risks and challenges going forward, and any effect the conflict may have on the election or after. The immediate reason for the incomplete signing of the ceasefire agreement was a sudden offensive launched by a previously defeated rebel group, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, the MNDAA, or the Kokang group, in the Kokang region of northeastern Shan State in February this year. The fighting is still ongoing, although it has now reduced a little. The government insisted that the Kokang and its 2 allies were to be excluded from signing the agreement initially. On the other hand, ethnic groups had long said that they would refuse to sign if any of their number were excluded. In the end, only a few groups held to this promise, and another 8 signed, but this is the immediate reason for this incomplete signing. This also moves me on to a second point on the influence of China. The largely ethnic Chinese Kokang are thought to have links across the border, if not with Beijing, then perhaps with elements in Kunming in Yunnan province. There are strong cross-border economic links, both illegal and legal trade. And these elements in China may have turned a blind eye to what the MNDAA was up to. Additionally, a senior member of the Myanmar Peace Center, a technical advisory body to the government on the peace process, recently told Reuters that China had pressured the Kachin Independence Army, one of the most important rebel groups, not to sign the agreement. Although he denied this the next day in an article in Xinhua, the Chinese state news agency, he was actually very unambiguous in his first statement. China has long been reluctant to accept other international observers to the peace process, and combined with concerns over Myanmar's closer relationship with the US and other Western powers after beginning of reforms, as well as the Neighbouring suspension of the huge Chinese-built Myitsone hydroelectric dam in 2011, Beijing may be attempting to shore up its influence in the borderlands and the country as a whole. And just in the last few days, we've seen another armed group, the United Wa State Army, also on the Chinese border, suggest that Chinese mediation in the peace process could be successful. Underlying these sort of issues is a fundamental lack of trust between the different sides. From the perspective of the ethnic armed groups, years of conflict, authoritarian rule, and discrimination. The militaries continue to control the politics despite the reform process, military offensive during the negotiations, and what they see as changing demands has exacerbated things from their point of view. From the military or government point of view, the ethnic armed groups have always had varying degrees of willingness to compromise with them, and the armed groups also are an affront to the fundamental mission of the military of defending Myanmar's sovereignty and national unity. Finally, on this point, I actually think the non-signatories could have been brought on board if they had been given more time. But there was a strong government drive to have it signed before the election, partly because the USDP wanted to profit electorally from having quote-unquote brought peace to the country. It would also have burnished the legacy of President Thein Sein, and the group's not necessarily happy to provide this boost. Now let's look at the effect on the election and the risk going forward. There's unlikely to be increased conflict-related violence during the election, as most of the armed groups have pledged not to disturb the vote. But large areas of the Kachin, Shan and Kayin states will not be able to vote. Many of these areas are under armed group control, as well as the Kokang region, which is under military rule following the uprising there this February. The Union Election Commission believes it will be impossible to hold free and fair elections in these areas due to insecurity. This could affect the number of votes for the small ethnic minority-based parties in particular. There is a danger of renewed military offensives against the non-signatories after the election, despite government promises to the contrary. And there is now talk about an alliance between the non-signatory groups. Some of these groups include the United Wa State Army mentioned previously. That is the strongest group and thought to have some 20 to 30,000 men under arms. The Kachin Independence Army is thought to have 7 to 10,000 soldiers. Politically, part of why the NCA was achieved in the first place was that the most politically contentious issues were in fact pushed back to the next stage of the peace process. This next very ambitious stage, known as the political dialogue stage, aims to reform in part the country's political system and will include even more actors than the ceasefire negotiations. Is fraught with risk and has been described variously as a minefield and beyond the manageable. It's scheduled to begin in mid-January, just after the election, but before the next government has come into power. This seems like a bad time to start, but if it's not started, this will invalidate the NCA. And so something needs to be done by the current government to start commissions and mechanisms and so forth, which will then have to be handed over to the next government to hold the proper political dialogue. An NLD election win could add uncertainty to the peace process, as we could previously assume that the military and USDP-led government were more or less the same page regarding their vision for peace. The NLD may have a slightly different one. Aung San Suu Kyi did not attend the signing ceremony for the NCA, and she has also warned armed groups against rushing into a deal. While the NCA text will not be renegotiated, seeing as it has already been signed before the election, the political dialogue stage could become more complicated, even more complicated. And there are also several other challenges to peace building in general that we can discuss further in the Q&A. But let me end on some positives. All the groups that participated in the talks, including the non-signatory groups, agreed to the text of the current deal and fundamentally want peace, as does the government. The government has left an open door policy for signing, and many groups may decide to sign at a later stage, although probably not until a few months after the election, when the political scene is more settled. The deal itself provides for joint monitoring, the cessation of offensive troop movements, demining, the coordination of emergency relief, etc., which will have positive effects in conflict areas. The signatories have been removed from the list of unlawful associations, signaling a step toward the eventual integration of these groups into the broader political and economic system. Areas controlled by these groups are also likely to see a boost in economic development. So finally, the peace process is integral to Myanmar's wider reforms and continued evolution as a state. And an absence of fighting would help facilitate further economic development and possibly political reform, but many challenges remain, and I'm happy to speak more about those in the Q&A. Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much indeed to both of you. We've had a number of questions, I think, starting to come in. But let me just return, Hervé, if I may, to one of your central points, which was that really the political test is one that lies in the long transitional period that we face ahead. And you were clear in setting out the issue of the constitutional arrangements that still favour the military and assign it a privileged position. You spoke about the continuing constraints on the role personally that Aung San Suu Kyi is likely to be able to play. And you talk about the risk of discrepancies arising between, as it were, the nominal legislative numbers and the actual shape of the government that will emerge and the policies that it's likely to favour. So is your assessment that the overall political mood in Myanmar is kind of tolerant of some of these ambiguities, sees them as integral to, uncharted political territory, part of a process of evolution that will eventually be a bit more clarified? Or do you think that there are real dangers in perhaps the emergence of a clear and confident outcome, but that outcome being circumscribed by these constitutional and by these force training restrictions?
Yeah. I think it's certainly true that what we're dealing with here is a potential train collision between popular expectations on the one hand and political realities as prescribed by the 2008 Constitution on the other. And the tone of the campaigning during the 60-day period of campaigning for both parties was quite polemic, and the National League for Democracy in particular has made it very front and center the idea that they would wish to dismantle the constitution, which they would see as really a vestige of military rule, as an anomaly, as a historical anomaly, and one that they would want to correct as quickly as possible through direct political confrontation with the military. That then competes with another idea, which is really the military self-perception, which it sees itself as a balancer. It has always seen itself as a necessary instrument to guard against unruly civilians and ethnic armed insurgency as well, and has deliberately designed over the course of several decades a constitution which is essentially unreformable without its consent. And ultimately, no future government, regardless of whether they are NLD or not, and regardless of their intentions, I mean, even if their intentions were to dismantle the constitution and state as we now know it, will require a degree of engagement with the military. And the more confrontational the approach is, that the less likely, in all probability, that will work, and the more likely that we'll see then a potential crisis scenario. A crisis scenario could take multiple forms. There could be challenges from below. The National League for Democracy has significant popular support. On the other hand, there's significant popular support being mobilized against the National League of Democracy as well through radicalized religious movements such as the Mabata. And it could also take the form of a constitutional challenge in terms of the interpretation and implementation of the Constitution. Now, a lot of the questions we've been receiving over the last few weeks is whether we're likely to see a Thai-style coup as a result of this. And I think really that the 2008 Constitution would make a coup redundant. There are sufficient instruments within the Constitution that would allow for the military or the commander-in-chief to take over for some time, to cancel the current legislature, and to call at some future points new elections. Those provisions all exist within the Constitution and wouldn't require rescinding the Constitution. So there are ample measures within the court of the military to intervene if it comes to what they would interpret as a crisis scenario. And much of everything has to do with the tone and degree of engagement that any incoming government will have with the military.
Thanks. This actually leads on to a question that's been posed by Aiko Doden, who's a senior commentator at NHK Japan Broadcasting, who asks over the chat function, what would actually qualify as a, quote, fair election? Is there a settled view on that? I think we say it's reasonably fair.
So We don't have a hugely scientific approach that we're taking, simply because it's not going to be clean and it'll be a glass half full, glass half empty situation. There will be irregularities. We've already spotted irregularities. I think it's a good enough election relative to the 2010 election. If that's my frame of reference, then I think the electoral circumstances now are vastly improved. That's to do with the fact that international observers are on the ground, the fact that there is a vibrant local media, the fact that the main opposition parties are actually contesting this election this time around, and that it would be that much more difficult to falsify the results in bulk in the same way that was perhaps done in 2010. That will be very difficult to pull off. And insofar as that's the case, I think we're dealing with a good enough election which will reflect ultimately in the results. The litmus test will be whether the NLD emerges as the largest party. I'm almost certain it will, if this is a reasonably free and fair election.
Now, if the NLD does very well, the requirement that it has for political horse trading would presumably be less. If that's not the case, we have a follow-on question from Lemahieu asking, what would the ethnic minority parties gain by joining political forces with the NLD? Obviously, if they were needed by the NLD, that would contribute to greater stability in the majority that it had, but what would they get out of it, the ethnic parties?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and one that they are asking themselves, because they view the opposition ethnic Burman party, the National League for Democracy, with a similar degree of trepidation, I would say, as they view the USDP. They are both ethnic Burman parties. Aung San Suu Kyi has in the past alluded to a more federalized political order. To what extent she's willing to go through with that, she's never really made clear. And on top of that, any federal state, any changes to the constitution would again require the military's consent. So if she's unable to muster the military's consent, even if she has the intention for a more federalized country, she's unlikely to be able to deliver for the ethnic minority parties. Which goes to the heart of the issue. I think there is really a three-way battle. None of the interest espoused by the respective constituencies, either the ethnic parties, the NLD, or the USDP, clearly align, which also adds to the ambiguity following the transition period, or during the transition period.
Thank you. We have a specific question here from Rob McCare, or BG Group, who asks what your views are, either of you, about the performance of ANP in Rakhine State.
Yeah, sorry, okay. I think that they are.
Do you want to just explain who they are?
Yeah, sorry. So the Rakhine State, as usual, is a particularly problematic region for the country. It's also the source of ethnic sectarian violence directed at a Muslim minority population called the Rohingya. It's also been the seat, the petri dish, as it were, where the sort of religious mass movements, Buddhist mass movements, really gained ground and have now gained ground nationally and have become a political force that has become increasingly xenophobic. The Rakhine Nationalities Development Party will do quite well. We can expect, it's to the extent that even the Chinese, who have a very important oil and gas pipeline that traverses Rakhine State from Kunming in China all the way to Kyaukphyu on the coast of the Bay of Bengal, has been has been engaging the Rakhine Nationalist Party in the expectation that they will actually run that state, and it's one of the few states where that falls outside the fold of either the USDP or the NLD.
Want to add to that, Jens?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Well, we have another question now. This is now turning to foreign policy, really, and it comes from Stefan Busch, who asks, in terms of the long-term balance of Myanmar's foreign policy posture, is it likely to tilt more towards China or towards India? Of course, India and China have been engaged in a kind of form of diplomatic competition for the affections, as it were, of Myanmar over the last 10 or 20 years or so. How is that changing, and what's the end result going to be?
Well, I can say briefly, I think China is the obvious winner, so to speak, in the so-called competition here. For one thing, it has a very long border with Myanmar, which India does. Well, so does India, but China has long had more influence in the country. It has, as Hervé said, energy interests and a pipeline going across the country, and has also good connections with both the military and the USDP. And Aung San Suu Kyi also visited Beijing earlier this year.
Yeah, I think to the extent, first of all, I think the competition factor is overplayed, especially when it comes to the elections. Both powers are essentially pragmatic in their approach to the elections and the transition. That is to say, they could do business with whoever wins the elections. Their predominant and overriding concern is that there is a smooth and stable transition of power. And China in particular, I think I would agree with Jens, has done the most in the degree of outreach, which has really been quite sophisticated in terms of expanding their relationships outside the existing cadre of military contacts, which was well developed prior to 2010, to civil society organizations, to the main opposition groups. That really was quite evident in the way that Aung San Suu Kyi was able to meet President Xi Jinping, which doesn't happen for everyone, particularly not if you are not a head of state, which she wasn't at that point. So I think that both countries are interested mainly in a smooth and stable transition, one that would be most favorable to foreign investment. To the extent that there is then competition within Myanmar for natural resources and infrastructure projects, it's clear that China has won by a mile. Its main investments remain intact despite a red herring, really, that I would argue was the suspension of the Myitsone Dam in 2011 by President Thein Sein. What people often overlook is that there are multiple hydroelectric dams being built on the Salween River with Chinese investment, that the government, as well as Suu Kyi as the head of a parliamentary commission investigating the copper mine, the Lepidong copper mine, was in fact favorable towards the Chinese investors, sided with the foreign investors against local grievances. So in that sense, I think both parties have really underlined that they want to cater to foreign investors, want to cater to everyone, Western as well as Asian. And Suu Kyi in particular has also been very pragmatic in terms of her outreach to China, and is very cognizant that China will be required as an integral player in the peace process, as a player that's had historical ties with the military, very strong ties, and as the most powerful neighbor, that will be the most consequential foreign policy relationship that she would have if the NLD comes to power.
And what would your characterization be of the economic reforms that have been launched in the last few years or so? What do you see as the main accomplishments? What are the main challenges? And what do we know about the overall economic policy instincts of the NLD towards some of these more sort of microeconomic as well as investment climate issues?
I mean, it's noticeable that neither party has run the campaign over the last 60 days, their respective campaigns, on the basis of a particularly well-defined economic plan. This has been very much an emotive election run on the big political principles of the day, but that hasn't really gone into the nitty-gritty of the respective economic policies. The USDP has promised more jobs, and it's tried to show under 5 years of President Thein Sein that liberalization has benefited the economy and produced diversified the economy and produced greater jobs. It's also created a lot more uncertainty, in that we've seen a rise in land grabs as a result of increased speculation, and if anything, it's the last 5 years have revealed more problems than answers when it comes to the management of the economy. And I'm not sure that the USDP has really made the most convincing case that it has the best economic credentials. On the other hand, the NLD has come out with a policy paper on the economy, which really revolves around, I think, 5 issues. One would be boosting agriculture, the other would be prudent fiscal and monetary policy, reforming government administration, creating infrastructure and establishing knowledge which builds a creative economy. I don't think any political party would necessarily dispute any of those. Again, they're quite general. And actually, what I see through the NLD's economic policy papers is really a quite overt agenda to try to restructure, rationalize the bureaucracy of state, of government, from township level above. And partly that's also a political agenda. The General Administration Department, which is run through the Home Affairs Ministry, is a military portfolio. So if the NLD were to come to power, it would be obviously a priority of theirs to try to rationalize and to bring under their control the civil service. And I think that reads quite clearly in their economic plans. But really the fundamental point is that neither party has been particularly well defined in its economic approach for the next 5 years.
Thank you. Just sort of turning back to the China thing, I mean, it seems that from your analysis, China is the main strategic beneficiary of the emerging situation in Myanmar, and part of that is economic as well. Where do you see the US and Europe in this picture? I mean, obviously they were part of the motive force pushing the reforms that we are seeing now take the current shape of the election, but are they likely to recede to the margins overall in terms of the influence they're likely to have, the interest that they can expect to develop with regard to Myanmar? And if so, why? Is there a particular reason for this?
I mean, it's a tricky situation in the sense that both are having to recalibrate their approaches on the basis of what emerges in the transition period and what the results are, and how free and fair the election is. And that is a layer of conditionality in their foreign policy and even in their economic outreach, which doesn't exist for India and China, for example. They want stability, they want a smooth transition, but these additional layers and conditions matter less. So we've seen the Europeans actually take a more pragmatic approach than or more pro-engagement approach, which has actually also been criticized in the sense that people have said that the West and Western players in particular have lost a lot of their leverage by perhaps prematurely suspending and lifting sanctions. And that perhaps the answer, if the elections are less than free and fair, would be to resume a program of targeted sanctions against particular individuals and organizations. And particularly the US is likely to espouse that kind of approach. On the other hand, there are major development funders or donors. They're major players in humanitarian aid. They are in large part also sponsoring the peace process initiative. And I don't think any of those initiatives are likely to disappear overnight, regardless of the outcome of the results. I think we're going to see more pragmatic engagement, albeit perhaps more hesitant than Asian, sort of India, China, or ASEAN countries. So it's a bit more tentative for them.
Yeah,
Yes, do you agree with that assessment of the role of the outside community?
I would agree with that. I think just to add very quickly on a geopolitical level, I think we'll certainly see Western powers retain some influence and continue to be engaged with Myanmar. After all, one reason for the Myanmar beginning the reform process in 2011 was said to be a wish to balance Chinese influence in the country.
Thank you. Let me just return to the question of the political leadership situation. As was noted before, Aung San Suu Kyi has indicated that she would be above the presidency. She has alluded, I think, also to the fact that she has somebody in mind as a presidential candidate from her side, although as of yesterday at least, I think that person hadn't been specified. Let me just ask one question, is what criteria do you think she is likely to apply in making a selection, and do we have any sense of who that person might be?
The answer is no, we don't, and I think that's deliberate in the sense that it would be a fairly unknown player. It would so as not to overshadow the leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi. The reality is that none of the individuals which currently dominate politics have a clear-cut route to power. I mean, Suu Kyi, neither Thein Sein, neither the military, and so we're likely to see another compromise figure president. And if that were to come out of the NLD ranks, I mean, rumors are swirling. It's premature. I don't think a decision has certainly not been made, and I don't think she necessarily knows herself at this stage. But among the names which have been floated are prominent members of the NLD Central Executive Committee, like Win Tain, but he's 73 years old and suffering health problems. Others such as Tin Chaw, who's another senior party member and a confidant, has been floated. Even U Tenu, who's an octogenarian and president emeritus of the National League for Democracy, has been floated as a potential as presidential material by virtue of the fact that he was once Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. And then perhaps the more surprising rumors are that Suu Kyi's might even consider her own personal physician, Dr. Tin Myo Win, who's also quite influential within the cadre of the National League for Democracy, as a trusted and reliable presidential candidate. But I think at this stage far too premature to speculate, but I think we can be reasonably certain that it will be a fairly obscure figure that doesn't dominate politics at the moment.
Which brings me to actually my real question, which is the current election to a significant extent can be attributed to the continuous efforts of Suu Kyi over many years to raise the profile of her country, to get people engaged, to exert pressure on the regime, and she obviously has a celebrated role in this. But to what extent do you think that the ambiguities over the question of eventual succession, the absence of a strong cadre of individuals to head the NLD as a whole, risks being detrimental to the ability of the NLD to continue to push for the goals over the long term that it currently espouses? Is this likely to be the status quo going forward, or is it likely that Suu Kyi might be persuaded of the need to develop a kind of a successor generation in order to safeguard the legacy of which presumably she is proud?
Yeah, well, I mean, they've had 5 years to do it by now, and we haven't seen very much in the way of developing a new generation of really prominent and influential NLD cadre of politicians. We do have some young MPs. There's a clear support base for the NLD, but there seems to be a disconnect between, on the one hand, that support base, and on the other hand, the Central Executive Committee, which is aging, and Suu Kyi among them looks to be the youngest, and she's actually not too young herself anymore. So it will be a big problem for the National League for Democracy. They also, on top of that, have very little expertise or track record of running a government. That's not of their own doing, obviously, but there will be a deficit in know-how and policy background which will be required for the various ministries. One important point will be to build a broader consortium than just the NLD. There are very influential members of civil society, such as the 1988 student protest group run by Min Ko Nai and Koko Ji. Those are probably the most powerful individuals after Suu Kyi in the wider pro-democracy movement. But the NLD made a very conscious decision not to engage them and not to include them within their within their candidate list for the elections, which was seen to sour the relationship that the NLD has with the wider pro-democracy movement. So I think that's something we should be very wary of, and there will not be much time if it does come to forming a government. They'll have essentially the period from January onwards to build a viable cabinet, which takes power on the 29th of March 2016. So one hopes that they have plans in place, but we haven't seen much evidence of it.
And what's the assessment of the coherence and the resilience of the military? I mean, do they have their own leadership issues? Is there a generational question there as well? And to what extent do you think they have confidence that over the medium term, and in the face of successive presumable elections in which forms of legitimacy are generated, they can continue to defend and cling on to the privileges which they've got under the Constitution? Are there differences of opinion on this? Do they come to the surface?
Well, so far we've seen, to be honest, not a lot of willingness on the part of the military to want to change its current constitutional position. They control 25% of parliamentary seats, and so can control any constitutional amendments. And I think there's a question here whether this is in fact the intended end state that they were looking for their disciplined democracy, as they call it.
Yeah, much depends on the viability of the USDP. If they maintain, albeit a significantly smaller but still existent presence within Parliament, perhaps up to 15% of seats, then that will be really the vehicle through which cohorts of retiring generals and retiring officers enter civilian politics, and that's been a trend established in the lead up to the 2010 general elections. The entire group of current USDP officials, including its chairman Teu, the president Thein Sein, the ousted chairman Sreman, were all former generals, and I think that the plan in place has been for the USDP to remain existent, and for that to continue being a vehicle through which the military can essentially transfer some of its best officers into the civilian fold to assume office or to play some role in future coalition politics. But that requires, again, the USDP surviving this hurdle coming up on Sunday.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time, and I have to bring this discussion to a close now, but it does sound from everything that the both of you have said that we'll have every reason to return to this subject over the next 2 or 3 months or so. I'd like to thank Hervé Lemahieu and Jens Wardenaer for the presentations, and also to thank those of you in the audience for the questions that you participated. I want to emphasize that a recording of this webinar is going to be made available on the IISS website in upcoming days, so do look out for that if you'd like to listen to it again. In the meantime, we encourage you to continue to engage us on these questions, and do also distribute the link to the recording to any colleagues of yours